NASA delays the Artemis II mission, but also teases some exciting plans. China debuts another Long March rocket, Jared Isaacman is named nominee for NASA Administrator, and Orbex ditches its own spaceport in Scotland. We'll have all that and a whole lot more this week in Spaceflight. This week, NASA provided an update on the Artemis II mission, as well as the timeline for the Artemis program in general. Artemis II will be the first mission to send humans on a trajectory around the moon since Apollo 17 in 1972. But before that mission is ready to fly, NASA has to get one important thing sorted: Orion's heat shield. When the Artemis I Orion capsule returned from its trip around the moon nearly 2 years ago, NASA engineers were not pleased with the state of its heat shield. In fact, it fared much worse than expected, and large chunks of material were missing. Even though Orion returned safely, the heat of re-entry ate a bit too much into NASA's safety margins, so the agency launched an investigation. Well, the results of the investigation are in, and this week, NASA management approved new plans for Artemis II that take the heat shield issues into account. So what did NASA find? Orion used a so-called skip guidance entry technique to re-enter Earth's atmosphere. During this maneuver, Orion entered the atmosphere, skipped back out using aerodynamic lift, and then came back in for a final time. This technique extended the capsule's range, easing recovery operations, but it also turned out to be harder on the heat shield than expected. The heat shield is covered in an ablative material called avcoat, and during the skip, this material cooled down from the initial heat of re-entry. That process generated gases inside of the heat shield, and unfortunately, the permeability of the avcoat varied across the heat shield, meaning that in many places, those gases couldn't escape. So as the heat shield heated up during the final re-entry, they expanded, cracked the heat shield, and caused chunks to fly off. Engineers found a total of 100 spots where the material broke off in ways that it wasn't supposed to. Yikes! But how could this happen? Didn't NASA test and simulate the heat shield beforehand? Well, apparently not enough. While the Apollo capsules also use the avcoat material, the formula for it has slightly changed over the years to now not incorporate certain harmful materials, and also some knowledge of the time has simply just been lost. Moreover, NASA also used a different heat shield design for easier manufacturing. All of this and other factors combined meant that NASA couldn't accurately predict the heat shield's behavior in its entirety. Most critically, the agency wasn't able to test the problematic conditions and wrongly assumed that the heat shield would be okay during that phase. Seeing the battered heat shield from Artemis I, NASA engineers set up facilities to test the heat shield in all conditions and eventually managed to get to the root cause. Now they've devised a new method of producing avcoat with the right permeability so that future heat shields won't suffer from the same problems. Unfortunately, there is one other elephant in the room, and that is the size of Artemis II's heat shield. This heat shield has already been completed, and replacing it would delay the mission by a year. But luckily, NASA decided that instead of replacing it, they can simply change Orion's trajectory so that the skips are shorter. So this week, NASA management decided unanimously that this would be the safe and right way forward. With that, NASA Administrator Bill Nelson announced a new date for Artemis II. Its launch is now planned for April of 2026. That's a 7-month delay compared to the original September 2025 date, but NASA wants to use the extra time to make the mission more robust. Additionally, engineers needed more time to solve some problems with Orion's Environmental Control and Life Support System, or ECLSS, which has now been resolved. NASA is now ready to get SLS ready for April 2026 and is planning to commence stacking the boosters really soon. Now, while this stacking means that the clock now starts ticking on those boosters, as they're only certified for a year, the agency sees no issues recertifying them like it did for Artemis I. While Orion's heat shield was the main focus of the briefing, Nelson also announced a date for Artemis III, the mission set to return humans to the lunar surface. This mission is now planned for mid-2027, and as Nelson pointed out, this is well ahead of China's plans to do the same in 2030. To ensure victory in the new space race, NASA hopes to get some of Artemis III's objectives out of the way earlier. Deputy Associate Administrator Amit Kshatriya later teased that this might involve testing on-orbit communications between Starship and Orion on Artemis II. That would be an exciting mission with Starship and Orion approaching each other in orbit, and Artemis II Commander Reed Wiseman seemed to be ready for it.
Pam will definitely get this, but you're going to ask an astronaut to do more on their mission? Bring it on. That is what we live for. We are ready.
While these plans might sound great, they might not be as set in stone as NASA currently makes them look. When Artemis II flies and what the mission eventually looks like might ultimately be subject to political changes. This week, President-elect Donald Trump announced that he has nominated Jared Isaacman to follow in the footsteps of Bill Nelson to become the next NASA administrator. As you probably know, Isaacman caught the attention of the spaceflight community by funding and commanding the Inspiration 4 mission in September of 2021. He followed that up by founding the Polaris program, which is essentially a private test program for commercial human spaceflight technology to support technological development for future missions to the Moon and Mars. A few months ago, he returned to space on the first Polaris mission, Polaris Dawn, during which he and his crew set multiple records and performed the first commercial spacewalk. Now, what his nomination for NASA administrator means for his future involvement in Polaris is yet unclear, as it's unlikely that he'll find the time for the required training and, of course, any missions themselves. Following his nomination, Isaacman also announced that he plans to resign as CEO of Shift4, the payment company that he founded in 1999, once he's confirmed by the Senate in January. So he will likely have to do the same for Polaris. So what does Jared have in stock as NASA administrator? Well, his tenure as a commercial astronaut might give us some clues. With his missions, he aimed to inspire and get people excited for spaceflight. He set his eyes on the Moon and Mars and has championed commercial space. Meanwhile, he's also criticized a few NASA programs, including the SLS rocket that supports the Artemis missions. It's been rumored that this rocket may be on the chopping block to cut costs and make NASA more efficient. So what that actually means for future missions, such as Artemis II, remains to be seen. But the incumbent administrator, Bill Nelson, doesn't seem too concerned and believes that the new plans for Artemis II are safe.
Your question is, are they going to axe the Artemis and insert the Starship? And first of all, there is one human-rated spacecraft that is flying and that has already flown beyond the Moon farther than any other human-rated spacecraft. And that's the SLS combined with Orion. Secondly, this is a partnership. It's a commercial partnership. It's an international partnership.
For now, we'll have to wait and see what Isaacman's plans are for NASA and how much freedom the next administration will grant him to execute those plans. We definitely hope that he'll succeed in getting people excited for space, science, and exploration, regardless of political preferences. And now we'll take a glimpse at some other stories across space, starting with United Launch Alliance, which has some reusability hardware to show for its Vulcan rocket. Unlike most reusable rockets, ULA is not planning to return Vulcan's entire first stage, but instead, it plans to detach and recover the rocket's engine section for reuse, so ULA can reuse the rocket's most expensive parts. The company calls this plan SMART, which is short for Sensible Modular Autonomous Return Technology. ULA had been quiet on the concept for a while, but this week, CEO Tori Bruno shared some pictures and announced that a critical design review is underway. The first picture shows qualification hardware for the booster's thrust structure, and the second shows a giant inflatable ring. This ring is part of the inflatable heat shield that will protect the engine section from the heat of re-entry. Bruno mentioned that this ring is only halfway across the cone, which will be nearly twice as big at 10 meters in diameter. While it will be a while before we see this smart reuse in action, we're happy to finally see some of the hardware needed to make it a reality. NASA is making progress on the Nancy Grace Roman Space Telescope. This week, engineers installed the spacecraft's main optical telescope on the instrument carrier. Once operational, this telescope will help astronomers answer questions about dark energy, infrared astrophysics, and exoplanets. To do so, it'll be outfitted with two instruments, a coronagraph that blocks the glare of distant stars so that exoplanets can be observed directly, and the wide field instrument, the camera astronomers will use to capture the sky. While Roman's mirror is the same size as Hubble's, this camera can see an area 100 times greater than Hubble. In November, the telescope that's making this all possible arrived at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, where NASA is putting the spacecraft together. It's now installed on the instrument carrier, a structure which will keep the telescope and its instrument precisely aligned. This is just one of the many steps that NASA needs to take to get the Space Telescope ready for launch in May of 2027, so it can finally be a space telescope. This week, Stoke Space quietly updated its website, revealing new renders of its Nova rocket and, it's changed quite a bit. Both the first and second stages have now been stretched compared to the previous renders that we saw of the rocket. Stoke also seems like it might have ditched the paint on the first stage and went somewhat Starship style with just bare stainless steel metal for that as well. The new render also shows no clear signs of a stage separation system, with the second stage heat shield and aerospike engine seemingly sitting on top of the booster during flight. Perhaps this indicates that Nova will make use of hot staging for flight. Stoke also made a few other updates to its website, showing new pictures of Stage 1 flight hardware production, as well as a new video recapping the company's activities this year. A video that shows new views of the first stage engine test campaign over the last few months, among other things. And continuing with news about fully reusable rockets, SpaceX is already gearing up to test its Starship Flight 7 vehicles. The company recently rolled the massive Super Heavy booster for that mission, Booster 14, out to the launch site for engine testing. And that testing could occur as soon as this Saturday, at least according to the road closures posted by Cameron County on its website. Another closure is also scheduled for Monday, so we may have multiple different tests instead of going straight to a static fire test. In addition to this, we also just had the ship static fire stand rolling from the Massey Outpost to the production site at Starbase, indicating that Ship 33, the one for Flight 7, will be undergoing engine testing soon. With all of this in place, it's sure looking like we're gonna get all of the individual testing of both vehicles completed before the end of the year. And of course, we'll cover all of this in more detail on next week's Starbase Update episode. NASA's Voyager 1 is back in action. You may remember from a few weeks ago that the Interstellar Traveler had turned off its main X-band radio transmitter and resorted to its S-band antenna that hadn't been used in decades. Unfortunately, that antenna is much weaker, so NASA had a tough time contacting Voyager 1, which is currently farther from Earth than any other spacecraft. This also meant that it was no longer able to send back science data. The issue arose when engineers turned on a heater and the spacecraft's fault protection system sensed that Voyager had too little power, so it responded by turning off the main antenna. That fault protection system is designed to protect the spacecraft by turning off any non-essential systems, but at this point, there aren't really any more non-essential systems left to turn off, so it decided that the X-band antenna had to go. Dwindling power is one of the main issues that the aging Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 spacecraft are dealing with. The Voyagers have been in space for nearly half a century, and NASA has turned off nearly all of their systems to conserve power. Both spacecraft are operating only 4 out of their 10 science instruments. Fortunately, NASA managed to turn Voyager 1's main antenna back on, and the spacecraft has resumed its regular operation of studying particles, plasma, and magnetic fields in interstellar space. Orbex is moving to a different spaceport for the first launch of its rocket called Prime. The UK-based spaceflight company has been building its own launch complex at Sutherland Spaceport since May of 2023, but this week, Orbex announced that it's moving to the other Scottish spaceport, Saxavord Spaceport in the Shetland Islands. Now, you may know this spaceport as the location where Rocket Factory Augsburg plans to launch from, and had a not-so-successful static fire test earlier this year. While neither spaceport has hosted a launch yet, Saxavord has all the licensing and paperwork done and is ready to support a launch. With the move, Orbex hopes to be able to launch Prime for the first time next year. But the small Prime rocket is only the start of Orbex's plans. The company also announced that it's starting development on a medium-lift launch vehicle called Proxima. Pausing the construction of Sutherland Spaceport will free up funds to support this upcoming rocket. The move doesn't spell the end of Sutherland just yet, though, as Orbex will retain its 50-year lease on the launch site for future expansion. Right as the work paused in Sutherland, construction started on a third Scottish spaceport, confusingly named Spaceport 1. This commercial launch site for suborbital launches hopes to see its first liftoff in autumn of next year. Now let's take a look at the space traffic this week and see what's coming up next week in spaceflight. This was a very active week with a ton of launches, so let's get started with the first one of the week. None other than a SpaceX Falcon 9, of course. Liftoff took place on November 30th at 5 o'clock UTC from Space Launch Complex 40 in Florida. The mission was carrying a batch of 24 Starlink V2 mini satellites into low Earth orbit. The first stage for this launch, B-1083, was flying for a 6th time, and it successfully landed on SpaceX's drone ship Just Read the Instructions. Going from the east coast to the west coast of the US, there was another Falcon 9 launch, this time from Vandenberg. Liftoff happened on November 30th at 8:10 UTC, just a few hours after the previous launch from Florida. The mission was carrying a batch of Starlink V2 mini satellites and 2 Starshield satellites for the National Reconnaissance Office as part of the agency's NROL-126 mission. Similar to its previous launch from Vandenberg, SpaceX's coverage once again started after liftoff rather than before. This mission is now the 5th officially recognized mission for the NRO's Proliferated Space Architecture constellation, which consists of a swarm of hundreds of satellites orbiting the Earth to provide several different types of intelligence to the agency. This type of intelligence gathering relies on several satellites instead of a larger dedicated one, making it more resilient against enemy attacks and jamming. While not fully confirmed, it's largely speculated that these are SpaceX Starshield satellites, a government version of the Starlink satellite bus fitted with sensors built and developed by Northrop Grumman. Prior official missions for this constellation carried entire batches of Starshield satellites, but for this mission in particular, that was not the case. Instead, SpaceX decided to launch 20 regular Starlink V2 mini satellites along with 2 Starshield satellites. This also marks the first time Starlink V2 mini satellites have been launched into a 70-degree inclination orbit. Up until now, SpaceX had only launched Starlink V1.5 satellites, and that was between 2021 and 2023. The first stage for this mission, B1088, was a new booster, and it now gets to join the fleet after successfully landing on the drone ship Of Course I Still Love You, ready to launch once again in just a few weeks. And from booster debuts, we'll go to rocket debuts with the first launch of the Chang 12 rocket out of China. The flight began on November 30th at 14:25 UTC from Launch Complex 2 at the commercial Wenchang Satellite Launch Center. The rocket was carrying 2 satellites into low Earth orbit. These are both test satellites for testing satellite internet technology for different providers, although not much information has been disclosed at this time. This was the first flight of this new Changzheng rocket, the Chang 12, which joins the long list of Changzheng rockets being developed by different agencies within the Chinese government. This one in particular was developed and built by the Shanghai Academy of Spaceflight Technology, also known as SAST, and is a medium-lift launch vehicle very similar in size and performance to the Falcon 9 in its V1.1 configuration. Much like what happened to Falcon 9, SAST wants to upgrade the Changzheng 12 in the future to introduce upgrades in performance and to propulsively land the first stage for reuse. That, however, will probably take some time to materialize. That Changzheng 12 debut flight was the 29th and final orbital flight of November, and yes, that's almost 1 launch per day. It's been quite an active month. In fact, it's quite possibly the most active month in the entire history of orbital spaceflight. With those 29 flights, the world ended November with 229 launches, breaking the record for number of orbital launches in a year, which was last year's 221. At this rate, we could see up to a total of 250 launches by the end of 2024, or maybe even up to 260 before the year is out, with over 30 launches still planned for this, the last month of the year. But before going into how the first few launches of December went, we have to go all the way to Mercury, where ESA and JAXA's Bepi-Colombo spacecraft flew by at the opening of the month. The spacecraft swung by the closest planet to our sun this last week on December 1st, making its closest approach to Mercury at 1423 UTC at a distance of 37,628 kilometers from the surface. This flyby tweaked the spacecraft's trajectory, changing its orbit around the sun and allowing it to save fuel as it gradually makes its way to eventually orbit Mercury. During this flyby, the Bepi-Colombo spacecraft used its infrared spectrometer for the first time, giving us a never-before-seen observation of Mercury. Unfortunately, it'll take some time for those images and data to be fully downloaded and processed, so we'll have to be patient for that to come out. A 6th and hopefully final flyby of Mercury is expected next month, which will further change the orbit and set Bepi-Colombo for an orbital insertion around Mercury in late 2026. Going back to launches, the next couple happened from China and from the same spaceport. The first one of this doubleheader was a Changzheng 3BE, launching on December 3rd at 5:56 UTC from Launch Complex 3 at the Xichang Satellite Launch Center. The rocket was carrying the TJS-13 satellite into a geosynchronous transfer orbit. TJS stands for Tongxian Jishu Xi'an, which roughly means Communication Technology Test Satellite. Not much more is known, as it's a classified satellite for the Chinese military. The second launch of this doubleheader was of a Kuaizhou 1A rocket from one of the mobile launch pads at Xichang. Liftoff took place the day after, on December 4th at 4:46 UTC, and it was carrying the Haishao 1 satellite into low Earth orbit. The Haishao 1 satellite is a synthetic aperture radar satellite from the Chinese Academy of Science meant to study ocean dynamics from space with its radar systems. This was the first flight of the upgraded Kuaizhou 1A rocket. The third stage of the rocket now has the same diameter as the first and second stages, the fourth stage has been upgraded to be restartable, and the new version also accommodates a larger payload fairing as well. Overall, these upgrades boost the rocket's performance by 30 to 50%, depending on the destination orbit. Going further down the list of launches, we also had another Falcon 9, the third of 5 Falcon 9 launches this week. That launch happened on December 4th at 10:13 UTC from Space Launch Complex 40 in Florida, and it carried 24 Starlink V2 mini satellites into low Earth orbit. The first stage for this mission, B-1067, was a record breaker, becoming the first to fly 24 times. It was also a rather fast turnaround time for a high flight booster at 22 days, and the cherry on top is that it successfully landed on SpaceX's drone ship a shortfall of gravitas, so it'll be able to continue to break reusability records in the future. This week we also had the launch of a Soyuz 2.1B rocket from Plesetsk. The launch took place on December 4th at 18:03 UTC, carrying a classified payload to low Earth orbit for the Russian Ministry of Defense. As usual for classified Russian payloads, it was officially named Cosmos 2580, but it's theorized that this might be a Lotos S1 satellite, a type of electronics intelligence satellite system. After that, we had the 4th Falcon 9 launch of the week, this time from Vandenberg. Liftoff happened on December 5th at 3:05 UTC, carrying another batch of Starlink direct-to-cell and Starlink V2 mini satellites into low Earth orbit. Once again, the SpaceX coverage began after liftoff, but despite that, everything went successfully with the mission. With this mission, SpaceX has now completed the first constellation of direct-to-cell Starlink satellites, but this won't mean the end of launches of those types of satellites, as just next week, we have another batch of them launching. The booster for this mission, B-1081, was flying for a 12th time, and it successfully landed on Of Course I Still Love You. With this mission, SpaceX has now launched a total of 7,523 Starlink satellites, of which 675 have re-entered over the course of the program, and 6,031 Starlink satellites have moved into their operational orbit. And from the original Starlink, we'll go to the Chinese Starlink with the Changzheng 6A rocket. That launch took off just an hour later on December 5th at 4:41 UTC from Launch Complex 9A at the Taiyuan Satellite Launch Center. The rocket was carrying a batch of Qianfan satellites into polar orbit. Qianfan is a low Earth orbit satellite internet constellation very much like Starlink or OneWeb, developed by Shanghai Spacecom Satellite Technology. This is the third operational launch of this constellation, which has so far been into polar orbits. And believe it or not, there were still more launches this week, the next one being India's PSLV rocket. Liftoff, or leap-off if you will, took place on December 5th at 10:34 UTC from the Satish Dhawan Launch Center, carrying the European Space Agency's Proba 3 spacecraft into a highly elliptical orbit. The Proba 3 mission consists of a pair of spacecraft that will try to fly in formation, one occulting the sun relative to the other, in order to study the feasibility of doing something similar with an actual space telescope. This type of formation flying would create an artificial eclipse that could allow future telescopes to directly observe exoplanets. The 5th and final Falcon 9 launch of the week took place just a few hours later from Florida. The launch was also on December 5th, but at 16:10 UTC from Launch Complex 39A, carrying the SXM-9 satellite into a geosynchronous transfer orbit for Sirius XM. The SXM-9 satellite is the latest radio broadcast satellite for Sirius XM, a company known for its satellite radio service, and some of you may even have it. The satellite was built as a replacement for the SXM-7 satellite, which was also launched on a Falcon 9 a few years ago, but unfortunately suffered issues a few weeks after arriving in geostationary orbit. The first stage for this mission, B-1076, was flying for a 19th time and successfully landed on SpaceX's drone ship Just Read the Instructions. And finally, to wrap up the super active and quite varied week of launches, we had the return to flight of Arianespace's Vega C rocket from French Guiana. This was another leap-off, with the high thrust-to-weight ratio Vega C rocket making its own rumble in the jungle on December 5th at 21:20 UTC. And yes, that's 5 launches on December 5th. The mission was carrying the European Space Agency's Sentinel-1C satellite into a sun-synchronous orbit. This satellite is the third in the Sentinel-1 series of satellites, which use C-band synthetic aperture radar to observe the Earth in all weather conditions and also during the night, since it doesn't use optical wavelengths. The satellite serves as something of a replacement to the Sentinel-1B satellite, which failed in orbit a few years ago, so this was quite an important flight for ESA to restore those important Earth observation capabilities. It was even more important because this was the return to flight of Vega C. The rocket had a successful debut flight back in July of 2022, but its second flight in December of 2022 didn't go so well. A second stage failure terminated the flight prematurely without ever coming close to orbit. The road to recovery wasn't easy either, as teams hit a snag back in July of last year when a second stage failed during ground testing, adding yet another issue to the list of things that needed to be fixed. That work seems to have paid off though, as the flight was completely successful with Sentinel-1C now in orbit and calling back home. So that's a sigh of relief for both ESA and Arianespace. And now to Ryan for some late-breaking news.
Remember the part where Elysia just said, and finally to wrap up the superactive week? Well, that didn't wrap up the superactive week because we had a surprise launch from Iran on Friday, December 6th at 03:14 UTC. Iranian media reported shortly after launch that a Simorgh rocket successfully launched from the Semnan Space Center at the Imam Khomeini Spaceport, carrying 3 payloads into a low Earth orbit. The launch featured the first flight of the Saman 1 kick stage, which was used to insert a test CubeSat called 4-1 into a low Earth orbit.
Going into next week, and I'm a bit scared to say this out loud, but we only have 3 launches on the schedule, for now, and they're also all Falcon 9 rockets. The first of these will be taking off from Florida with Starlink direct-to-cell and V2 mini satellites. The 4-hour launch window is set to open on December 8th at 5:10 UTC. Next week, we'll also have the return of SpaceX's CRS-31 Cargo Dragon spacecraft. The capsule is set to undock from the station's Harmony module on December 12th at 16:05 UTC. Splashdown off the coast of Florida should happen a few hours later. That same day, we should have 2 back-to-back Falcon 9 launches, with the first taking place from Vandenberg with more Starlink satellites. The 4-hour launch window is set to open on December 12th at 19:33 UTC. The second will be from Florida, carrying another pair of O3B mPOWER satellites for SES. The launch window for that mission will open on December 12th at 20:58 UTC. And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. I'm Elysia Segal for NSF, and I'll see you all again next week to recap this week in spaceflight.